So, a while back, a week or two before I made the switch to Linux, I started playing the game Team Fortress 2. A friend had recommended it, and it really stood out from the crowd of cookie-cutter shooters on the market today. I've really enjoyed the game. I even streamed it and used footage from it for a video. And about the same time, I was heading down the rabbit hole that is switching to Linux. I was researching what distro I wanted to choose, which programs would run on Linux, and that kind of thing, and I got to the point where I decided that I definitely wanted to try switching. There was just one more thing to do: check to make sure all my games were compatible. This was the part I was most dreading. For those who aren't aware, Linux support for gaming is not as good as it is on Windows. Game compatibility in Linux basically falls into three categories: native support, meaning the game's developers officially support and develop the game for the Linux platform; runs with tweaks, which means the game is not officially supported, but it can run with some tinkering and the help of programs like Wine or Proton; and lastly, borked, meaning the game will either not run or it won't run well enough to actually play. To my surprise, most of the games in my Steam library actually had native Linux support, and the ones that didn't had pretty good community feedback for running those games with tweaks. Now, bringing this back to TF2, TF2 was one of those games that was actually natively supported, so I had pretty high hopes for running it well. To fast forward a bit, I burnt a Linux installer to a USB stick, performed an exorcism to get Windows off my hard drives, installed Linux, and installed my games, among them TF2. I fire up the game and start playing, and the first thing I noticed was that I was getting a ton of frame drops. Now, if you don't know, TF2 was released in 2007. My computer is no slouch. There was no reason for my frames to be dropping like this. I was getting dips down to around 30 FPS when a lot of entities were on screen, and on a 144Hz monitor, that's pretty noticeable. On Windows, I was able to run the game at a stable 150 to 200 FPS, so something definitely wasn't right. I did a little bit of research and tried a few things, but I wasn't able to resolve the issue fully. Reading through numerous forum posts, it seemed like the game's performance on Linux was hit and miss. Some people ran the game with no issue, and others had the same issue as me. But this is not the part that really annoys me about it. Finally getting to the title of the video, the thing that annoys me is this. Many of the users who complained of these problems were able to run the Windows version of TF2 on Linux with Proton, which is a tool used to run Windows games on Linux, and get performance on par with Windows doing things that way. The only issue with this is that it forces the game to run in insecure mode, which triggers Valve anti-cheat to stop you from joining any VAC secure servers, which means that any matchmaking server and most community servers will be off limits to you. Basically, you can run the game, but you don't get to actually play it. This kind of thing really sucks, because the best solution for a difficult problem is held just out of reach by VAC. But Flicka, if VAC allowed the game to run in insecure mode, it'd be easier for hackers to load their clients. Now, this I would normally agree with, but for one thing. VAC doesn't do jack to stop hackers on TF2 anyway. It's a terrible anti-cheat. Anyone who's played the game for more than a day will be able to tell you the game is rampant with bots, all which use aimbot, spinbot, wall hacks, you name it. In my experience, it's to the point where you can count on finding bots in at least 1 out of 3 matches in casual matchmaking. On the weekend, sometimes there's so many bots you can't find a match without them, and there's enough of them in each match to prevent each other from being vote kicked. VAC is literally a joke at this point. Dozens of bots are going undetected forever. Meanwhile, VAC is busy blocking people who just want to play the game with decent performance. Now, I was able to eventually get TF2 running close to that of Windows. However, it took a bit of tweaking, like installing mods and editing launch options, not to mention the research and time needed to figure out which mods and launch options are best to use. It's not something that someone like myself would consider especially difficult, but it was more difficult than running the game with Proton, which would have been a better solution but for VAC, and it was far from the just works experience many users are used to, especially if they're switching over to Linux from Windows. Again, if VAC was actually a competent anti-cheat that did its job most of the time, I would say that this is just something necessary for the common good. After all, Linux users are in the minority, enough so that making the game better for all other users at their expense could be justified if there were no alternatives. But the fact that a portion of the game's player base is denied the option to run the game better, basically at no benefit to anyone else, is just ridiculous. And when something doesn't do its job, you either fix it or replace it. I don't actually expect Valve to do anything about this, seeing that the game is quite old at this point, with a large part of the player base considering it to be mostly abandoned. However, a lot of other online games also have issues running with Wine or Proton on Linux because of similar issues with an anti-cheat. This is always a huge bummer, especially if the game runs perfectly on Linux otherwise. Perhaps developers could take notice of TF2 as an example, And if they can't be bothered to port the game to the Linux platform, at least make an effort to ensure Proton and Wine compatibility. As someone who is in the process of learning to code, I can see why the developers wouldn't want to take all the time and effort to cater to a very small minority of the user base, so it would be a great way to meet in the middle. The devs wouldn't have to recode the whole game for Linux, and us Linux users could still get a shot at a good experience. Thankfully, for the time being, this experience has been the worst one so far. Most of the games in my library, even the ones that don't natively run on Linux, have run pretty well so far. So if gaming on Linux is something you've been wanting to try for a while or are just now hearing about, I would definitely encourage you to give it a try.